we do have a panel for you. We have a very special panel for you. I'm going to bring to the stage Guy Pajani, Sylvain Vigueur, and Martin Woodward. Would you like to join me? Up to you.
As far as we can from you.
Yeah. Do you know what? I'm going to move that chair because it's going to annoy me looking at an empty chair. There we go. So I'm going to come to you, because we've only got about half an hour together. I'm going to come to you straight away and cut right to the chase. Give me 3 minutes each on what you're all about. Martin.
So I'm Martin Woodward. I'm a last-minute substitution onto this panel.
He's also chairman of my board.
Yeah, exactly. But I've worked with Amanda long enough never to say no to Amanda, so this is good. So I work at GitHub, where I help developers create delightful things. We do a lot of work with the open source community, helping make sure that GitHub works for our foundations and for general open source maintainers. And then I also work heavily with the GitHub Copilot team and integrating GitHub Copilot features, making sure that's available, and also working to make sure we get GitHub Copilot, which is an AI code assistant tool, making that available to as many people as possible. So we made it available to students and teachers from the get-go to help make sure we give the next generation of computer scientists access to pocket calculators, kind of thing. And then we also make it available to open source maintainers, and now we've just recently made it available to the entire world if you've got a GitHub account. So that's me.
Okay. Sylvain.
That's pretty cool.
Am I saying that properly?
Sylvain.
Sylvain, okay. See, my accent
same.
hasn't been improved
French
like
accent.
Lucy's. Yeah, sorry about that.
That's
Sylvain.
right. Cool. So yeah, I work at GraphCore, which is one of the few startups in UK doing AI, and we're doing hardware for AI. So we're starting from chips, put that on hardware, put that in data center, and then we train kind of model and make them go fast. So I've been doing that for the last 5 years, and it's been really good to see that 5 years ago, the largest model on Earth was 340 million parameters, and people thought it was huge, and it was already quite complex to train, and things have been moving extremely fast. So what I do now with the applied AI team is work with research on new methods and also with silicon architecture. And the main question is, if we start doing a new chip today that's going to be out in a couple of years, what sort of model will people want to run, what sort of efficiency they want, and so on. So we've been really linking the AI research with the hardware world kind of thing to build next-gen product.
I'm Guy Pajani. I previously founded Sneak, which is how I got involved in OpenUK and kind of working a lot on open source security and software security as a whole. About a year ago, I kind of accepted that I'm an addict and I'm going to found another company. And I founded Tessel, where we are trying to reimagine software development for the AI era, trying to sort of rethink software development from first principles, not just automate the existing workflow, but rather think, how would it really change? And we have a thesis that we think open source, that we think software development will become spec-centric versus code-centric. I'll talk about that a bit more in my session later on. But we're kind of trying to define this new software development paradigm, what does it mean? So we think it's important as we think about the future of software development that it's not just some sort of company sitting in some lab trying to sort of think about what it is, but rather a community activity and involved activity. And so it's important for us to participate in this great community and to engage software developers wherever they are and try to kind of shape this future.
So one of the things that I really admired about what Michelle Marie was saying, I was quite concerned about Lucy, to be quite honest, because everybody talks about AI taking your job, and I have never seen an AI that I thought might take my job. Maybe it was just the questions you were asking, or maybe you've trained her on my talks or something, but she was pretty much saying what I say. I like the fact that you admitted a mistake, right? And one of the problems we have with tech, and one of the problems we see right now, is that there's this expectation that everything's going to be perfect, and if something's wrong, we jump on it. And if you're not pushing the boundaries enough to make mistakes, you're not rolling things out well, in my view. But Martin, I know you've learned a lot about rolling stuff out. So share a bit about what you've learned by rolling out Copilot.
Yeah, it's as we're rolling it out, we're one of the early tools to kind of roll out Gen AI. and we had to, work with a lot of the things as we go along. How do we keep the human in the loop at all times? How do we make it iterative? Developers are very vocal in their feedback. That's the joy of my job. And making sure that you're always in control is the key point in all of these AI interactions. Guy mentioned there around a spec-driven workflow. That's definitely something that we've seen as the future. We also see AIs being used heavily in terms of like brainstorming and things. If you set up your AI chatbot to work to help you with like Socratic thinking, then actually it helps you brainstorm, it helps you generate ideas. AIs are not creative. It feels that way when you sort of give it a set of bullet points and say, write my team's performance reviews or something. Not that I've done that, team, if you're in the audience. But you need to give it the data, you need to give it the bullet points, otherwise you're just going to get what was in that core model. So we learned a lot about how do we get the context, how do we give that. We also learn a lot about general AI adoption. AI adoption runs differently inside organizations to traditional kind of tooling rollouts. Traditionally, you would deploy a tool, give a tool, people use the tool. But actually, what we're seeing with AI is it follows the classic Moore adoption curve a lot more. So you give AI tools to your entire population of people in the company. 25–30% of people will grab it and run with it, the kind of people that are sat in this audience here that are interested. But then you need to help the rest of the community, like your late majority, your early majority, that sort of thing. You need to push over the innovation gap. You need to cross the chasm to help your teams adopt these tools, because people are naturally skeptical. As developers, we're all naturally skeptical people. And we're all busy people, and so helping them learn how to use these tools, helping them to learn how to get the most of it, and helping them learn that AI isn't this magic thing that can solve their problems. It's a tool like any other tool. So that's probably the biggest things that we learn.
Yeah, I think that's really important. Let's see if your headset works. Sylvain,
Yeah,
you're building AI processors. We're going to come back to Martin's point in a minute. You're building AI processors. So can we, while we've got you on stage here, explore a little bit the hardware side? How can we leverage hardware and openness to accelerate this AI adoption?
Yeah, so it's been fascinating to see the change in the last 5 years of just processing power and seeing it changing extremely rapidly. So one of the things that we need the most at the moment is to work on efficiency. I think that's the word that came more and more to the discussion. And so because everything is getting bigger, and now we started building the biggest data center on Earth to train those even larger models, which is great in terms of capability, because I think we've been pushing towards making AI that is capable of helping us progress in science, for example. It's really important. At the same time, there is also the question of how we're going to all use AI in everyday life, and that's probably not running gigantic data center kind of thing. So we look at efficiency, and I think we need at least to find 1,000x, maybe 10,000, so like 3–4 order of magnitude kind of thing, and that's not impossible. And one of the nice stories that we saw coming recently is about numerical format. So usually people use very high precision number to compute things for their model, and just by optimizing this, we can get about 10x more performance. And that's something that's been possible through effort in research, so a lot of like new algorithm, putting that into hardware as well, and then integrating it in all the tools we use. So for example, now in PyTorch, there is a new library that enables people to use those kind of formats more easily.
So Guy, coming over to you, we were talking in the green room, and I always worry that almost you end up having the conversation that you want to have on stage, and it's not fresh when you get on stage. But we were talking in the green room about trust, about transparency, something that Lucy actually brought up when she was talking about herself. And it was funny having our conversation and coming in here and hearing her. She also sounded like she might have been trained on you. So tell me a little bit about the trust and transparency. Start us off in that discussion.
Yeah, for sure. So I think I do feel like I just want to quickly comment on these conversations, which is interesting also from a tool builder perspective, as you talk about the humps and all of that, that it's also hard when you build on AI. You kind of learn that you don't know if your product works because it's probabilistic, and you run to it and sort of evolving the practice, whether it is about the scale limits or whether it is about kind of the means of how you test and how you assess and how you evaluate your product. It's kind of an interesting new domain to doing it, which I found very interesting. But back to Amanda's question. So, I think my kind of slight beef that I kind of raised in the green room is kind of with the name of these open weights models as being open. And I think when you think about AI today, it is manifested, it was demonstrated well with Lucy and the OpenLLM project, which is primarily we're talking about, there is the weights that is the output, there's the source code that processed it, there's the training data, there's also a slightly more elusive and less standardized training process of, it's not like the data is not some static thing that you run, it's also how did reinforcement learning happen. So you can kind of talk about the training methodology. And I think we talk a lot about open weights versus open source, and I think we've kind of standardized on calling it open weights versus source, which is good. But I think we need to remember that AI is not software. And AI is made up of software, but also data and also training processes and different evaluations and tuning methods. And because of that, when we think about what we want when we talk about open source AI, we need to go back again to kind of fundamentals a little bit and first principles to say what is it that we want from open source. And I think what we want is we want transparency, we want to be able to inspect what has happened, what data came into it, how was the bias or alignment done, and et cetera. We want to be able to, if the creator legitimately chooses not to continue working it, we want the community to have independence. We want the ability to kind of fork that data and continue the work if we want to take it in a different path. We want an opportunity to contribute. Open source wins many times because the community can rally and can provide more information, more support, more help, more expansion. And I think none of these things are available when we talk about open weights. And so I guess my critique a little bit is I really like these freeware models, but I just don't think they're open. I think they are freeware, which is amazing and has all sorts of advantages for it and give you more control than a hosted model.
So what for you is freeware? Which ones would you, if you don't mind saying?
I think the core open weights models, like we call open weights models today, they're basically all kind of in that same, maybe like this OpenLLM France is an exception, but when you think about Llama, you think about DeepSeek, you think about Mistral's kind of models when they are kind of open weights, all of them are basically in that context. They are free to use, they are downloadable, you can build upon them and tune them, but you have to reverse engineer them to understand what biases or such they have in the system. If the company chooses not to do, if Meta decides, which is within their rights, to not do Llama 4, and you've invested a lot in building on Llama 3 as your core, you're just kind of stuck. There's no option for you to fork and say, you know what, then I will do Llama 4. You can't do that because you don't have the information. So in that sense,
can I ask you something? This is not in the script, but I want to ask you this. So when I was listening to people talk yesterday, and normally I start by saying I'm not an AI expert, and I refuse to talk about it until I had to, because I don't know what I'm talking about in enough depth. So when I hear you all talking about this, yesterday what I was hearing is it's not like software. So when we see a new version coming out, you can sort of catch up with software, right? And the way that the different iterations of the LLMs are coming out, they're very discrete. They don't naturally flow one to the next. Can you just explain that a little bit?
Yeah, I think AI does have an evolution. So it's not like software in the sense that it is not predictable. And we were talking before, if you tried to take the exact data that you have and run it through the same training process, you're going to get a slightly different model. And so behavior, and even the existing running LLM, you ask it a question twice, you're going to get a different answer. And so I think in general it's less predictable, and we have to think about it. But it does have an evolution. And so I think when you look at how we improve, how we evolve, it does imply all of these different things. They all have practices that let's sort of say, in a general sense, improve. The data improves. We cleaned it up more. We grew it to have more data. We've specialized it and labeled it better to understand it, et cetera, et cetera. The training processes definitely improve. I mean, very notably now with DeepSeek, for instance, a lot of heavy, in general, a trend towards synthetic data and reinforcement learning, and there's kind of been a shift from pre-training to post-training in terms of where the kind of the gold lies, like where is this an improvement? So like all of these things improve, and just like in software, they improve in different ways. Like sometimes you get something that's higher precision, sometimes you get something that's cheaper, sometimes you get something that is more broader purpose or usefulness. So I do think that the open source kind of ethos of community contribution and kind of evolution and all of that, like those apply and are desirable, but they just need, because it's not software, it's not the same as saying, hey, I will publish llamas open source, and therefore people can now duplicate a version of them or fork it if llama stops or contribute. Like I'm very fussed about that lack of ability to contribute. I know I'm talking long here, so I'll just say one more thing, but I've got a podcast called the AI Native Dev, and I talk to smarter people than I about AI and kind of how they build stuff with it. And I got a chance to talk to the founder of Augment, which is a big sort of AI dev company, and they build on open models, and I asked him, how do you contribute back? Like they're doing a bunch of tunings, they care about the open models, and the short of the answer is they can't. Like they want to, they find bugs that are sort of reproducible and do it, but they have no means of contributing that back. And so I think solving that is going to be very valuable.
And I know Martin wants to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, it's around that model choice. Like we're at the beginning of this hockey stick of evolution of models, and at the minute we're seeing this rapid acceleration. None of us know yet if this is the beginning of a hockey stick that like is goes like that, or if we're one that goes like that and is going to level out. We just don't know. We do know we're seeing real productivity gains from applying these tools. We also know that we need to be able to be flexible with model choice. Like we need, as we're building systems that build on top of LLMs, we need to be able to rapidly swap out like the version that we're using. So as not locking yourself into a particular model. So that's something that we learned along as we're building it. The other thing is that we need to be mindful about, these tools are giving use. So yes. While we haven't, as a community, reached a common understanding as what we mean when we apply open principles to this AI sort of epoch that we're in. We don't want to stop people from being part of that conversation. We want to have that. That's the best thing about open source, is that we have these conversations out in the open. Yesterday and today, you don't always agree with everybody on your panels, but you want to present their opinions, and that's where we're at. And we need to be careful we don't lock people out of those conversations, that we don't over-regulate.
Yeah,
because,
there's two. I totally agree with you, but one of the problems we have, though, is because we have these open conversations and we argue with each other in public, the people who see that from outside who don't know us think that we're fractured. It's a real problem with, Lord Clement Jones is coming onto the stage shortly, but it's a real problem for us because the message isn't consistent sometimes. Although it's what we have to do, right?
It's what we have to do because we don't know, the sad truth is we don't know what the answer is. And I know that's horrific to kind of admit to people.
No, it's fine.
But we're at the beginning of the journey and we're going to learn as we go together. And that's the joy of the community around open source. And to Guy's point, we need to find ways of making sure that continues as we go down this path, But we'll get there because it's going to be, we know that's this ability to be able to debate openly is the key to success. So I fundamentally believe we'll get there. It just might take us some time.
Two quick points about evolution and about testing model and evaluation. So first, to build model, you need models. So actually, Llama 3 is built on Llama 2, which is built on Llama 1. So actually, if you want to build new AI, you need to be able to access model in the first place. And that's very important to know. Because now people use model to create synthetic data to train new model. So that's super important. And so there is this evolution of model actually relate to each other. And then evaluation. So one of the big things about openness is about telling how you tested your model. Because if you got some open source code, look, hopefully you get some tests and so on, but you also want to look at the code. You can read it, you can know what it does. You can't do that with model weights. So you can only relate to actually using the model. So when people explain how they tested the model exactly, that's I think part of the openness that is also super important. It's kind of open science, like how we trained it, but also how we tested it. That's also important.
And just to say that we talk a lot about licensing of the models themselves, but there's a lot of conversation and legitimately ownership questions around the licensing of the data that they produce. So when we think about open data, we think about contributions. A lot of it is distilled data from models. It's you ask the model, you get a response, and I think that's great. But we need to, from an open source licensing, there's basically a whole domain of relevant licenses for open AI, not the company, but the sort of the concept that we need to work through. Like, what are you allowed to do with this data? Are there some MIT-style, GPL-style licenses that can exist that can say, hey, you're allowed to use this model's data to train, but there's some virality that sort of says that whatever it is that you build comes out of that. Like, is there a GPL-like thing like that? Is there elements about commerciability so that people can have a commercial interest in sort of publishing it? So a lot of these are like open, big, complicated questions that, for instance, have changed substantially over the last year with the sort of the big shift towards synthetic data versus sort of the human feedback, which was the original breakthrough. So like a lot of this, it's hard to work it out. I think one of the questions is also who does that thinking. There's us as a community. There's initiatives like OpenLM France, which is interesting. I personally don't love the national suffix, in the sense that I think I'd love to sort of see cross borders, but I like that it's happening. And then, are there entities within the open source foundation world, within those that are really committed to this path? Sort of said, not volunteering to run one. Just sort of would love to have one.
We've got 11 and a half minutes. Thank you for saying that about the localization. I'm not a fan of what I would call local source rather than open source either, because we're a globally collaborative movement and we should engage and make room for everyone as far as we can within the law. And I think it's notable that 2 of the 3 panelists weren't born in the UK, I assume, because you had different places. It doesn't matter, right? We don't care. We're collaborative and we're global. So we'll also come back to that in a minute when we talk about AI regulation and the summit next week. But we haven't really mentioned DeepSeek, right? And everybody else who's not an open source is really excited about it. So we should talk a bit about DeepSeek, Guy. Do you want to kick it off? Do you want me to ask you something specific, or do you want me to just let you flow?
No, I mean, I'll say a few words to sort of get everybody level set. I think it's been discussed enough that maybe people know it, and then probably Sylvain will have kind of more of a close to the metal perspective to doing it. So DeepSeek, open weights model released from China, from a Chinese lab. What is it? 2 weeks ago, and kind of appended.
10 days, I think.
Appended. Well, V3 I think was more like 2 weeks. Was in December.
Yeah.
And then R1.
Yeah.
It's many claims to fame, but I sort of say the things that it is an open weights model, as we discussed before. It is its primary reason that it rocked the world are, I would sort of say, 2 primaries. One is just the cost element, like everything about cost and speed about it. Some of it is technical innovations about going down closer to the bare metal due to constraints of like necessity is the mother of all invention. A bit of an ironic kind of backfiring of the US chip restrictions that sort of got that lab to sort of invent novel ways that dramatically reduce the cost of not just training the models, but also the inference cost of running the models of it. So much so that it appended all the business models of like, can you even build an AI lab that feeds itself from charging for its API use? Can these be made free features of existing products? And then the second thing that I would just sort of say, so there's a lot about the cost, and the second is a lot on this notion of like a distillation and lack of human feedback, and the fact that they basically built on a lot of existing models from reasoning models, and that made it faster and cheaper to run. And again, another irony here of like a lot of people are not really crying for these sort of open AI labs who built on top of doubtful ownership of sort of data, which again, like I think we'll benefit from, but has questions about it now being kind of a bunch of the data has been taken from them. But I think that really kind of opened up a lot of the of kind of the question of that data ownership piece and what can you do, and it suddenly makes frontier models dramatically more expensive to create, because you have to kind of invent a bunch of these things and do that human feedback, while following becomes a lot easier.
But
so a lot of geopolitical and other sort of aspects.
Hugging Face are already working on that, right? They've taken the DeepSeek and they've taken the instructions, and they are working on the provability of how to do this, going back to those instructions and working on the data, right? Has anybody else looked at that?
Yes, so Hugging Face are just adding the extra bit in the openness kind of thing. So there was some things that have been described in more detail, some less detail, and I think Hugging Face is doing a great job to make more detail in those things that haven't been explained so much. I think for me, DeepSeek wasn't really surprising. I think the model kind of thing it's very great that those models are available, but at the same time, I think things are moving really fast, like the capability of model, and it's just in the usual kind of range. I think what is very new is not so V3 is a large language model, but R1 is a reasoning model. And that is a new type of model, and it's something that started with OpenAI 01 and now 03 kind of thing, and that is different. So the main shift we can see here is that we can have a model that when we use it, we can decide how much compute we want to use it. So before we had to decide, do I create a small model that's going to be cheap to run, but maybe not very powerful? Or do I do a big model that is always expensive to run, but potentially give better answer? Here with test time compute, you can do that for each question. So when you ask a question, you can decide, do we want to wait 10 seconds to get an answer, or do we want to wait half an hour and get a better result? So this shift in being able to decide every time we use a model, how much resource we want to put is very important and very exciting.
Yeah, I would just sort of say, like, so reasoning, it's interesting, the debate on, like, what is V3 bigger or sort of R1 bigger in terms of impact.
Yeah.
They were both significant, and they appended a bunch of those. But what's very much true is, like, R1 was just a very quick follow to 01. It isn't better, it isn't perceived as better than OpenAI's 01. But OpenAI's 01 was presumably far ahead, and then suddenly it sort of catches up so quickly and so much more cheaply that I think that's what rocked everybody.
Just to say about that on models, as IT people, we're always like, which one is the best? Which one does these capabilities? And that's not how they're working. We see now, even with the previous generation of models, with like GPT-4 and and Claude and things like that, Sonnet 3.5, they work comparably well for a lot of the tasks, but they have, to Guy's point, different kind of personalities based on some of their training sets and training data. And so, as a user of these, you get different answers. And to the points Ivan was making about what resources you use, oftentimes your model choice is determined by those trade-offs in terms of how much time do I want, how much accuracy do I need. And so it's important to not think, oh, I need to go get the latest and greatest model and pay, $100 per prompt, because that's just an inefficient way of running. You need to be very, very careful about model choice.
Just before we move on from that, I want to pick up on something you've all discussed about data. So one of the real challenges that I see in data, and Guy, you were talking about all the licenses and MIT and different things. And I don't know if Bart Farrell's still in the room. He was taking pictures of us a minute ago. He put this post out 2 days ago that starts with everybody shouting at me, pedantic lawyer, at the party the other night. And I'm going to be a pedantic lawyer. So data is not licensed in the same way as software, right? And people keep saying we should use MIT. No, we should not use MIT for data. We should use a data license. And I really think that we need to shift our focus from a legal community perspective to looking at the data and how we help to categorize what's open and what's not open in data, and the shades that might come in between.
Well, to slightly challenge that, I mean, there's another kind of lens to that, which is software today is like this software 2.0 or sort of whatever it is, current model is like running from, is driven by the code. You change the code, you change the behavior. Software of tomorrow changes by data. And the same code dictates, that's not what you change when you want to get different applications. The same code serves, a healthcare application and a code generation and what changes the behavior of the software that we create is the data. And so in that sense, when we think about how we licensed data before with Creative Commons and those types of licenses, they were much more aimed at descriptive output data, descriptive data, output data, and the likes. And this is input data. This is sort of changing where software 3.0, as people call it sometimes, is actually driven by data. And so I do think there's a new type of license. Like neither the existing software licenses nor the existing data licenses are fit for purpose, probably for license.
And if I can just add something to that, because I am sad, I spent a lot of late nights last week reading the terms of use at DeepSeek, and they're not applicable to the free product. But what they do really well is they go into the depth about input and output data. So if you want to see a really good explanation of how that works from a legal perspective, reading their terms of use for their tools and their API is super helpful. But what it does is it pushes back on the user in their commercial piece all of the liability, all of the protections that you have to give to citizens, copyright compliances, regulatory compliances, confidentiality, contract stuff, all goes back onto the user. So it is really complex.
Can I make one really quick point? I know we need we need to be careful as a community though about, again, the over-regulation point, because as a big company, they can afford to deal with all these regulations. Open source people can't as much. And then we also need to be careful around, should we not have models available to the open community globally that can cure cancer? Because they've all been trained on medical data, which we could never make open. And so those are the questions we're wrestling with, and none of us know the answers.
And that's the focus, I think, from the legal community we need now. I do have to wrap us up. And to wrap us up, I want to mention very briefly, on the 10th and 11th in Paris, there is an AI Action Summit. And Alexandra, the founder at Linagura, will be there. I will be there. I think it's the first time we've really seen people from open source being invited by governments. And we talked yesterday about Dango at Davos, and that we're growing up and we're being brought into the growing up table now as a community. If I'm representing you at the Action Summit, and we know Anastasia didn't make it today, and she picks up your point, Martin, on regulatory capture, and we're going to talk about that in the next panel when we talk about the legal things. What am I going to the Action Summit to ask for the open source community? What is it you want to see? They're very focused on 5 missions, one of which is global governance. What is the one thing that I ask them for you? And who wants to? You didn't know I was going to ask you this, but who wants to go first? And you've got not much time. What one thing would you like from government? And if it's nothing, it's fine. That makes our job easy. I can just go and tell them we need to fix the data.
I think for me it's a big question, because we started with the AI Safety Summit initially in UK, which I think was really good to start having this conversation about this societal change that AI is doing, because it's not just model technology, but it's also legal, it's also most fields affected by AI. So I think having government making clear that this is very important, it's good, and seeing a lot of investment from government is also important.
I would say it's I get asked that a lot as a business when you think about it as open. And then I think maybe I'll come back to that sort of investing in the sort of the public good type elements and trying to avoid that being around national lines, which, by the way, I don't think OpenLL in France is along national lines. It is an investment from it. So I think more investments of that nature into open that are public investments whose goal is not to raise a commercial interest, but rather raise everybody with high transparency as a role model, as opposed to regulating a forced transparency, which has its own place.
And I have to say, I think the UK's been okay on this, right? That they've
been
light
fantastic
touch
on this point,
exactly. And Martin, do you want to give us a last thought?
Yeah, I mean, it's to that point, it's around collaboration. It's too easy to get into this mindset that it's a zero-sum game, and we've seen from our experience that it is not. And so how can we collaborate as a global community together? How can we help accelerate human progress together? Because it's clear that AI is a powerful tool to help us do that.
So I'm going to say, because you were also reshuffled this morning and Martin joined us last minute, thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. I really appreciate you doing this panel with us, and it's been fantastic. Thank you.